For decades, the Swedish model was a global case study, an example of success built on social cohesion and security. Today, Sweden remains a case study, but for the opposite reason. According to official data, it is the country with the highest number of fatal shootings in Europe. How could this have happened? How did a progressive utopia turn into a hotbed of gang violence? In this episode of the Inside Your Country series, we will analyse the official data to find the answers, separating facts from propaganda. We will uncover what made the crime explosion possible, who the criminals are, and what the political responses have been, by examining data and contradictions in government documents. Welcome to Amazing Europe. That successful model had a name, folkhemmet, the people's home. It was not merely a welfare system, it was a national philosophy. Coined by Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson, the idea was as simple as it was powerful. The nation should be like a family, with the state caring for every citizen from the cradle to the grave, without privileged or disadvantaged members. But such an ambitious system did not rest on laws alone. It relied on an invisible ingredient, a social glue almost impossible to replicate. Tillit, trust. A deep, almost absolute trust in institutions, in the police, and above all between fellow citizens. It was that trust which made it possible to leave your front door unlocked or your bicycle unattended. The real security system was not the locks, but social cohesion. This is not a nostalgic myth. It was an almost perfect balance, built on three pillars: an omnipresent state, blind trust, and a very high degree of cultural homogeneity. An ordered, predictable world. But how did all this translate into real safety before Sweden underwent its great transformation? The Sweden of folkhemmet was not only perceived as safe, it was measurably so. The statistics from that period are so distant from today's that they seem to belong to another world. The most significant figure is that for lethal violence. For much of the 1950s and 1960s, the homicide rate consistently hovered around 0.7 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. An extraordinary level of safety, lower than that of many countries now considered safe. Predatory crime was almost non-existent. Official data from the early 1960s recorded only a few hundred robberies per year across the entire country. The concept of street violence, or of organised gangs controlling territory, was simply inconceivable. Violence did exist, of course, but it was mostly limited to occasional brawls, often linked to alcohol. This was Sweden, a country where crime was an anomaly, not an epidemic. That safe Sweden no longer exists. At the start of the new millennium, a crack opened in the Swedish model, but it was after 2013 that the crack became a chasm. A 2021 official report by the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention, BRÅ, put a disconcerting anomaly in black and white. Sweden is the only country in Europe to have recorded a significant and sustained increase in firearm violence. The figures are ruthless. While the European average of deaths from firearms was falling to 1.6 per million inhabitants, Sweden's number shot up past 4 per million, more than double the European average. In absolute terms, Sweden went from 17 firearm homicides in 2011 to 62 in 2022. And the most recent 2024 data confirm that firearms were used in almost half of all the country's homicides. BRÅ's analysis is even more specific. This epidemic does not strike at random. It is almost entirely concentrated among men aged 20 to 29. For this demographic group, the firearm mortality rate exploded to 18 deaths per million, a level unmatched in any comparable European country. But the violence pandemic has taken a second, terrifying form, identified by the Global Organised Crime Index as a Swedish specialty: the systematic use of explosives. The report speaks of grenades and improvised explosive devices frequently used in gang-related attacks. These are not isolated incidents, but a war zone tactic imported onto Swedish streets. Finally, a new form of crime has emerged, the most chilling symptom of the social fracture: the förnedringsrån, the humiliation robbery. It is not just theft. As revealed by investigative reports and documented in viral videos, the aim is to obliterate the victim's dignity, almost always that of a teenager. Young people forced to kiss their attackers' shoes, beaten for hours, sometimes even humiliated by being urinated on. All filmed and shared online to amplify the terror. An epidemic of shootings that strikes the young. The use of bombs as a tool of power. A culture of predatory violence founded on humiliation. But the crime wave has gone much further. Statistics normalised per 100,000 inhabitants reveal an erosion of safety across the board. The rate of reported assaults is more than 7 times higher than in the 1960s. The robbery rate, once almost non-existent, has quadrupled. The rate of drug-related offences has exploded, rising from a level close to zero to over 1,200 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, creating the economy that feeds the gangs. Finally, the most dramatic figure, the rate of reported rapes. Even allowing for crucial changes in the law and a greater propensity to report, the level recorded today is almost 20 times higher than 60 years ago, signalling a profound crisis in personal security. This is the crime scene. The question at this point is inevitable. Who are the actors in this war? The perpetrators of this wave of violence are not ordinary criminals. They are the actors in a structured ecosystem, a network that operates with business-like logic and paramilitary brutality. Today's Swedish criminal landscape is a dual power structure. On one side are the traditional motorcycle gangs, hierarchical and with global affiliations, and on the other, the true engine of the crisis, the criminal networks of the suburbs. The Global Organised Crime Index calls them poorly organised street networks. They lack the rigid structure of the mafia, but form fluid alliances, often based on family or clan ties, and are in constant conflict over control of territory. They thrive in the country's 65 vulnerable areas, where the state has lost the monopoly not only on violence, but also on hope. In these places, capital of violence, the reputation for being ruthless, is worth more than any academic qualification. The fuel for this criminal machine is twofold. The first is drugs. Sweden's cocaine market is expanding rapidly, and the global index is explicit. The surge in gang activity is closely linked to the cocaine trade. Turf wars over drug-dealing territories are the direct cause of most shootings. The second fuel is weapons. Sweden is today described as a key hub for arms trafficking in Northern Europe, with a steady flow of pistols, assault rifles, and even grenades coming via the Balkan route. But the most terrifying aspect of this network is its recruitment policy. Gangs systematically exploit social marginalisation to enlist an army of very young people, the child soldiers of the outskirts. Official 2024 reports have denounced the use of social media to recruit children as young as 11 for contract killings. Exploiting the lenient penalties applied to minors, the gangs use them as disposable foot soldiers. All of this operates in a spiral of impunity. With a gang homicide clearance rate below 25%, 3 out of 4 killers remain free. The state no longer delivers justice, and private revenge becomes the only law, fueling an endless feud. Who are the actors behind these crimes? To answer that question, we must first understand why it was left unasked for so long. For decades, Sweden was governed by what the political scientist Henrik Oskarsson called the Åsikts corridor, the opinion corridor. Imagine a narrow corridor. Opinions inside it are acceptable, those outside are taboo. Discussing a link between immigration and crime meant stepping out of the corridor. It was not illegal, but it resulted in civil death. You would be branded a racist and isolated from the media and political life. This mechanism of self-censorship led the National Council for Crime Prevention to stop publishing data on offenders' origins in 2005. For 16 years, while the suburbs burned, Sweden chose to fly blind. But in 2021, reality broke through the corridor walls. Brå was forced to publish a large new report. The figures on those pages, read without filters, are devastating. Before revealing them, however, we want to make a very important clarification. At Amazing Europe, we firmly reject any form of racism. We know full well that the equation foreigner equals criminal is an unfair oversimplification that misrepresents reality. At the same time, we believe hiding the data is pointless. For this reason, we will show the official figures published by the Swedish authorities themselves in 2021, so we can reflect on them together. And if you think this is the right approach, please support our project with a like, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you don't miss our new videos. So, who are these criminals? The raw figure is unequivocal. People born abroad are 2.5 times more likely to be suspected of a crime than native Swedes. But the most alarming figure concerns their children, the second generation born in Sweden. For them, the risk rises to 3.2 times. At this point, the standard defence from Swedish politics has always been the same. It's not about origin, it's about poverty. These kids commit crimes because they are poor and marginalised. The 2021 report, however, tested that thesis scientifically and rejected it. Statisticians performed a standardisation. In other words, they recalculated the data after mathematically removing differences in income, education level, age and sex. They compared immigrants and natives living under the same economic conditions. The result? The overrepresentation remains. Even when social conditions are equal, those born abroad remain almost twice as likely to commit offences as poor natives. This proves mathematically that poverty explains only part of the problem. There is something else: failed integration, gang culture, uprooting. If we look at who commits the most serious crimes, the data become even more specific. The report and its tables show that the highest suspicion rates are not evenly distributed among all immigrants, but are concentrated in specific groups from North Africa, East Africa, and Western Asia. The raw data indicate that suspects from countries such as Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria, or from Maghreb regions, have crime rates between 4 and 5 times higher than the native average. For the most violent crimes, the gap is abyssal. For murder and attempted murder, the relative risk for the foreign-born group is 5 times higher. For robberies, almost 5 times higher. These are the facts that for years were omitted from public communication, often diluted into generic categories such as non-native background, so as not to offend political sensitivities. But mathematics has no political sensitivities. These numbers tell the story of an integration that never happened, and of a social model that, in its attempt to be inclusive at all costs, ended up importing and incubating a violence it can no longer control. But how did we get to this point? How did the most organised, rational, and planned nation in the world lose control of its own territory? The answer does not lie in a single bad decision, but in a colossal short circuit between a noble ideal and an ignored reality. It all begins with a vision. In 1972, the economic crisis forced Sweden to stop importing labour. But Sweden did not close its borders. It changed their purpose. It replaced workers with refugees, turning immigration from a market necessity into a moral mission. The political elite, from right to left, embraced the dream of a humanitarian superpower. Reception became a state dogma, protected by the so-called opinion corridor we have already discussed. Those who disagreed with this system were labelled heretics or racists. Some claim that all of this was a cynical plan by the elite to import votes, or by businesses to lower wages. But the reality is that Swedish trade unions blocked the importation of low-cost labour as early as 1972. So, apparently, Sweden did not fail out of malice, but out of naivety. It failed because of a cultural blindness that prevented it from seeing how its social model was not universal, but extremely specific. A delicate system that worked only thanks to very high homogeneity and the blind trust of a people who had shared the same values for centuries. But with the mass arrival of immigrants, that homogeneity broke. The first mistake was economic. The Swedish labour market is hyper-specialised, with very high minimum wages defended by the unions. There are no low-skilled jobs. When hundreds of thousands of refugees with low levels of education arrived, the system had no place for them. Cut off from employment, they fell into the welfare trap. Generous benefits, designed not to leave anyone behind, produced the perverse effect of making work unprofitable. generating a permanent underclass living on state assistance, segregated from the productive society. The second mistake was urban planning. In the 1960s, Sweden built the miljonprogrammet, 1 million public housing units in enormous concrete complexes to eliminate slums. When migrants arrived, they were placed there. Native Swedes left, giving rise to the so-called white flight, the mass exodus of the native population to neighbourhoods without immigrants. The result? The creation of physical enclaves, isolated concrete city-states where the Swedish language and norms do not penetrate. The third mistake, the deepest one, was cultural. According to the World Values Survey, Sweden is the most individualistic and secular country in the world. The state is designed to deal with the single individual, but the newcomers often came from traditionalist societies based on clan structures and religion. The Swedish elite, convinced that integration would occur almost by osmosis, made a fatal error in terms of obligations. Free language courses have existed since the 1960s, but attending them did not mean one had to pass them. Until now, Sweden remained an anomaly in Europe. One could obtain citizenship without any mandatory language certification and without ever having opened a civics textbook. Only now, in 2025 and 2026, are policymakers rushing to introduce these tests for the first time. For decades, this absence of requirements was justified as tolerance, but critics gave it a harsher name, the racism of low expectations. It is a form of prejudice disguised as benevolence, the implicit idea that asking an immigrant to meet the same standards of competence and responsibility as a native is unfair, or worse, that they are incapable of doing so. Instead of treating newcomers as adult citizens from whom to demand commitment, the state treated them as passive guests to be cared for. And in this regulatory and moral vacuum, where the state retreated in the name of ruleless multiculturalism, clan structures and gangs took over. They filled the space left by institutions, offering a brutal but effective alternative: protection, identity, and a parallel justice. The result of this experiment is a demographic transformation unprecedented in modern history. In 1970, foreigners made up 5%. Today, residents born abroad exceed 2 million, 20% of the population. If we count the second generation, we reach over 26%. And the composition has changed radically. If once the largest foreign community was Finnish, today it is Syrian. We want to strongly reiterate that we are against racism, and that immigration in itself is not the problem. The issue is that Sweden tried to apply a system designed for a homogeneous society to a completely different reality, without adapting the rules and without requiring newcomers to accept local laws. And the cracks in that system have become the trenches of today's war. Faced with this reality, politics has been forced to surrender. The very same government, in documents from late 2025, acknowledges the existence of an unprecedented wave of violence. After the collapse of the asylum system, Sweden has carried out a historic U-turn. The humanitarian paradigm is dead, replaced by tougher measures. The government has launched the first national strategy against the gang economy, aimed at seizing their assets. It has closed the long-standing track change loophole that allowed rejected asylum seekers to remain as workers. But the most shocking measure, and the symbol of an educational failure, is the proposal to lower the age of criminal responsibility to 13. The state is being forced to treat children as criminals because gangs use them as hitmen. The scars on the social fabric are indelible. Tillit, the legendary Swedish trust, has crumbled. Today, the country officially counts 65 vulnerable areas, enclaves where state law struggles to enter and the rules of parallel societies prevail. The opinion corridor has been swept away by fear, leaving behind a polarized and distrustful country. The Swedish trajectory is a painful lesson for the entire West. It shows us that a welfare state, no matter how wealthy, cannot survive without cultural and social cohesion, and that ignoring reality in the name of ideology does not solve problems, it only makes them explode. Let us be clear, this does not mean falling into the opposite extreme, namely racism and social exclusion, two cancers that worsen the situation rather than improve it. What does improve the situation, in our view, is presenting the data without censorship and then trying to reflect on them together, which is exactly what we have tried to do in this video. We therefore look forward to your opinions and reflections in the comments. If this topic interests you, we recommend watching this video, where you will discover the 10 European nations with the highest levels of crime, according to real data. That's all for this video. See you next time.